Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Annual Lecture here at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. My name is Lisa Leff, and I'm the director of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies here at the museum. It is such a treat to be back here in person in the Rubenstein Auditorium, like in the old days before the pandemic. We used to do this all the time, but it really has been quite some time for us, and it just feels so good to be among all of you. We're also thrilled tonight to also be able to broadcast this event so that many other people watching from their homes around the world can also join in, even though they couldn't make it here to be with us tonight. Let me begin this evening with a thank you to the J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Charitable Trust. The Shapiro Trust enables the museum to bring a distinguished scholar to our museum each year to be in residence with us. They conduct innovative research about the Holocaust, and they bring that research to the public. While they're here, they lead seminars, they lecture at universities, and they serve as a resource to the museum and the general public about this history. Tonight's speaker was our 2021-2022 Shapiro Senior Scholar in Residence, Dr. Andrea Löw. Dr. Löw now serves as deputy head of the Center for Holocaust Studies at the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich. She also teaches at Mannheim University. She received her PhD in history from Ruhr University Bochum and previously served as research associate at the Institute for Contemporary History, where she conducted research for the Berlin office's source project that was called Jewish Persecution, 1933 to 45. Before that, she worked on the research project, the edition of the Lodz Ghetto Chronicle with the University of Gießen. Her main research areas include the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, Jewish history during the Holocaust, and the history of ghettos. Tonight, Andrea Löw will deliver a talk that was based on the research that she conducted while she was here in residence with us last year. The talk is entitled, "We Are Far, Very Far from Our Homes, the Deportation of German and Austrian Jews to the East." After the talk, my colleague Betsy Anthony, director of our Visiting Scholars programs, will moderate the Q&A. Andrea, over to you.
Thank you so much for this introduction, Lisa. And above all, thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to give this lecture tonight. And I'm even more grateful for these 9 months I have been able to spend here at the Holocaust Museum as a fellow. So I'm very grateful to the generosity of the Shapiro family. I had a really amazing and productive stay here at the museum. And this is really thanks to these wonderful colleagues at the Mandel Center and at the museum in general. So I'm really grateful for all your help and all the time you spent with me and for your friendship. And I would also like to take the opportunity to thank the survivors and children of survivors whom I met during my stay and who were so generous to share their story and to share share documents with them. And I know that some of them are listening online now, so I would really like to thank them. And with this, I'm going to start my presentation, and I want to start with 2 quotes. Wilhelm Schischa, who was deported from Vienna to Opole in occupied Poland in February 1941, together with his wife Johanna, writes on March 3rd, 1941 in a letter, I quote, "Everything here is covered in excrement and dirt. We have driven through huge snowfields across the Vistula. We are far, very far from our former home. And Heinz Rosenberg, who was deported from Hamburg to Minsk in November 1941, writes in his memoirs about his arrival, and I quote, "Hundreds of corpses covered the floor. There was blood everywhere, and food was still standing on the stoves and tables. All the rooms were in complete disarray. There was not a living soul to be found." The shock about the violence upon their arrival, the confrontation with the first dead, but also the attempts to find one's way, to organize life. All this is described in the accounts of those who sat on these transport trains and survived the following years in places they sometimes refer to as hell. I'm currently working and have been working while I was a Shapiro scholar in residency at the museum on a project about these deportees. And tonight I want to present some of my findings. Questions I will address include: what were the expectations and perceptions of the Jewish men, women, and children who were deported from numerous German cities to occupied Poland, but also to Riga and Minsk? How did they assess their situation after the shock of arriving in places so foreign to them? And how did they try to organize their lives? How did they perceive the local population? And conversely, how were they be seen by them? How did the attitude and behavior of the local German rulers affect those Jews, who, after all, were so much more familiar to them than the local Ostjuden, not least because of the common language, and who nevertheless eventually murdered them? The circumstances were different, depending on whether someone was deported to several towns in occupied Poland in the fall of 1939, the spring of 1940, or the spring of 1941, or whether the deportees were already confronted with mass murder directly upon arrival, as in Minsk and Riga, starting from the end of 1941, where parts of the local ghetto population had been shot to make room for the new arrivals. The latter then moved into the apartments of those who had just been murdered. What impact did this experience have on the self-perception and on how the little room for maneuver was still used? So tonight, I want to give you some insights into the history of the deportees, focusing on the examples of the deportations to occupied Poland in the spring of 1941 and the deportations to Riga and Minsk later that year. After the quick deportation of Poland, the Nazi leaders' ideas about what should happen to the German, Austrian, and also the Czech Jews changed. After forced immigration had previously been the means of choice to get as many Jews as possible to leave the German Reich, their evacuation, as they called it, into the newly occupied areas was now possible. Various deportation experiments between October 1939 and the spring of 1941 were each aborted. Numerous letters and postcards have survived from these Jews who were deported at an early stage. They describe the strange and very foreign world into which the authors found themselves thrown overnight. I just want to present some examples here. As I mentioned in the beginning, in February 1941, Wilhelm and Johanna Schischa were deported from Vienna to Opole Lubelskie. For almost a year, they wrote at least twice a week to their relatives in Vienna, and they also sent some letters to their daughter Lilly, who had left Vienna with a Kindertransport in 1939. They sometimes sent photos too. As Wilhelm Schischa mentions in his letters, he would ask the local photographer to take pictures for them. Many Jews had to stay in these kind of mass quarters. Wilhelm and Johanna Schischa managed to find a place with local Jews. And so after some days, after they arrived in Opole Lubelskie, he writes about an improvement of the situation, while still mentioning the dirt in the town. So he writes, "Since yesterday, it is already a little better. We are no longer lying on the floor, but have wooden beds. It is a relief to finally be able to stretch out our tired limbs completely. A lot is going on here all day long. The Viennese walk on the streets. which are full of excrement. So when reading these letters and seeing these photographs, the contrast between their former life in Vienna, where just a few days before they still had a home, they had their own bed, they had dreams, and they thought they had a future, and the conditions they were forced to live in now becomes very clear. And still they could not know what else was in store for them. On the left picture on this slide, you see how the Viennese Jews started building barracks because they just couldn't find housing in the small town of Opole. And about this building of barracks, Oskar Schischa writes in a letter on July 6, 1941, "I'm sending a photo of the building of a barrack in which about 120 people moved in last Friday." And on the right picture, you see the interior of such a barrack, and you see how these Viennese Jews were lying there, were standing in the barrack, and were trying to find a place to live. And on this picture, you see the local post office, which was certainly the most important place for the deportees, because this was where they received letters from the beloved ones, and especially parcels. You see many, many parcels on the picture, and these were really of utmost importance for their survival. And here you see, well, first of all, two examples of these letters. In the middle of the slide, it's Wilhelm Schischa's very neat and clear handwriting, and on the right side, it's Johanna Schischa's, she calls herself Hanchi, handwriting. And on the left, it's the last photograph we have from the two of them. It's from June 1941, and you see them standing there with this old wooden house behind them. And this was the last picture we have. And these are really very rare examples of photographs the deportees sent home to document what was happening to them for their loved ones. And also in these cases, we have letters and postcards written over a longer period, about a year. And this, of course, distinguishes these holdings from the individual letters that have survived from Jews deported to the same area in 1942, where we quite often just have like one last letter or one last postcard before the people perished. And here you see another example of such letters and postcards written by Hermann and Celine Mandelbaum, who were deported from Vienna to Modliborice. Hermann writes in April 1941, "We have been in this squalid nest for more than 4 weeks now, living among totally unsophisticated and unhygienic people. We, Mrs. and Mr. Fröhlich, live with a family of 6 in a single room, or rather a chicken coop. We force ourselves not to take everything very tragically, because we live here with the awareness and hope to see you, my dearest ones, quite soon in the best of health. May God help us that the war will soon be over, so that we can soon tell each other everything with joy." The postcard on the slide on the left side is the last message written by them, or at least the last we know about, and it dates from November 21st, 1941. The postcard and letters written by the Schischas, the Mandelbaums, and others document the shock about the conditions they had to live under after the deportation. Often they were full of disgust for the locals and their way of living. At other times, they were thankful for their help, stressing that they share their food and housing with them, although they hardly have anything themselves. Their only hope, and what made them try to endure everything, were letters and postcards from home, and the hope of being reunited soon. Both Wilhelm and Johanna Schischa and Hermann and Celine Mandelbaum did not survive. In the fall of 1941, the systematic deportations began. From mid-October to the beginning of November 1941, the National Socialists deported about 20,000 Jews from various cities of the so-called Old Reich, and also from Luxembourg, Vienna, and Prague, as well as 5,000 Roma from Burgenland to the Lodz ghetto. Local authorities protested further transports to the already overcrowded ghetto. And so Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich decided to direct the transports further east, to areas that had only come under German control with the attack on the Soviet Union. between November 41 and February 42, approximately 1,000 people each traveled in 32 transports to the so-called Reichskommissariat Ostland, namely to Riga and Minsk. In November 1941, 5 transports of Jews from the Reich also arrived in Kaunas or Kovno in occupied Lithuania, where they were murdered upon arrival. At the destinations, officials prepared for the arrivals of the deportees. They made room for them by murdering large parts of the local Jewish population. In Riga, SS and police forces with Latvian auxiliary police units murdered more than 27,000 Latvian Jews in the Rumbola forest on November 13th and December 8th and 9th, 41. And in Minsk, the SS murdered about 7,000 residents of the ghetto on November 7th and another 5,000 on November 20th. Sometimes at the same time, otherwise only a little later, the first Jews in the German Reich received orders to present themselves at predetermined assembly points for the deportation. Their property fell to the German Reich. They had to hand in a detailed survey of their possessions and hand over the key to their home. With the deportation, officially called evacuation, they became stateless. They were allowed to take hand luggage and a suitcase. They often knew only very vaguely that they were to be taken to the east. In a letter from Else Kalischer, dated October 23rd, 1941, shortly before the deportation from Berlin to Minsk, it is stated that they, quote, will meet an uncertain fate and probably disappear somewhere in the dark, end of quote. Some survivors report rumors, such as Kurt Löwenstein, who writes, of course, no one knew where the transport was going. It was rumored that it would go to Minsk, but other places were also mentioned. Then, upon departure, his identification card was stamped, evacuated from Berlin to Minsk on November 14th, 1941. But even the certainty about the destinations, which, by the way, many others did not have when the train left, did not mean that the people had even a rudimentary idea of what was in store for them. They really could not know, thinking in many cases that they were being taken to work. Here you see the last page of a diary written by a young woman. She was 19 or 20 years old, while sitting on a crowded train that had departed Vienna on November 23rd, 1941, with about 1,000 Jewish men, women, and children. In her diary, she notes how she's doing during the journey, which lasted several days. She writes, on the train into the unknown. Sitting closely together in the compartment, they hear that Riga is their destination. She describes the journey. She writes, on Sunday at 6 o'clock in the evening, we left Vienna. Trucks took us to the train, like cattle. During the night, we passed through Brno. Then we went on through Upper Silesia towards Poland. From Poland, we were traveling to East Prussia, and now we just crossed the Latvian border. And this is really the last sentence on this page, and it's the last sentence of the diary. And a little later, the young woman's life ended as well. The train had not crossed the Latvian, but the Lithuanian border. Originally, the transport was supposed to go to Riga, but at the end of November 1941, like 4 other trains, it was diverted at short notice to Kaunas. Here, Lithuanian auxiliary forces, under the command of members of the Einsatzkommando 3, shot the German and Austrian Jews shortly after their arrival at Fort 9, an old Tsarist fortification. According to German records, they shot the young diarist on November 29th. Even as more and more rumors and news about the actual fate of many Jews in occupied Eastern Europe leaked through, causing the fear of their own deportation to grow among those who stayed behind, many Jews still assumed that their labor would be needed after all, that they were supposed to build something up in the East. And to give you an example for this, I would like to mention the case of Oskar Hoffmann, who was deported from Cologne to Minsk at a later stage in July 1942. Upon arrival at the station in Minsk, the 18-year-old, whom you see on the slide, wrote a postcard to his former boss and now friend. And you see this last postcard on the slide, and it says, "After an 87-hour journey, we arrived here in Minsk in good health and spirits. It is said that we are to leave the station immediately, together with our luggage, to be assigned to our camp. It is assumed that we will be employed in agriculture in the immediate vicinity of Minsk. Whether we will stay here for a long time is still uncertain." And then on the other side of this postcard, he adds, "As I have just heard, there's some possibility that we will be able to pursue our occupations in local farms." And as Oskar Hoffmann writes these lines, his murderers are already standing by at the pit in Malé Trostinets, the extermination site near Minsk. A few hours after writing this postcard, Oskar Hoffmann is dead. Back to the winter of 1941. Those destined for deportation were often confronted with brutality and humiliation already at the assembly points. Some had to strip naked to be searched for valuables, for example. Hilde Schermann remembers how a Gestapo man yelled at her and pushed her into the room. She wrote, "I was in a daze. It was the first time in my life that a stranger pushed me. The beginning had been made. In Düsseldorf, in Germany. How was this to continue? And in a foreign country?" On this slide, you see pictures. Well, on the left, it's a picture of one of those assembly points. It's the assembly point in Bielefeld. And you see how bad the situation already was in these assembly points. It's totally crowded. People were lying on the floor. And on the right side, you see how the same people have to board their train, which would leave for Riga. I want to stress that we have many of these kind of photographs from deportations, but I want to stress that this is a perpetrator's view on these photographs. So, and this also makes these photographs I showed from the Schischa family so special, because this was really what the deported Jews wanted to be documented, whereas here we have the perpetrator's gaze. In this train you see on the right slide, which went from Bielefeld to Riga, Edith Blau and her mother Meta were sitting. And Edith sent postcards while she was on the train. You see one example here on the slide. She wrote a postcard to her uncle in the German city of Minden. And it says, "My dear ones, I'm standing in the moving train and write on the window. The night was terrible, but now it's comfortable again. We already look like pigs. No water, no light on the train. Hopefully we will be there very soon. Right to Riga soon." As you can see on the right top corner, the postcard was stamped in Königsberg. She threw it out of the window when she saw soldiers outside. And obviously these soldiers sent the postcards. This train journey, which usually lasted 3 days, took place in overcrowded and often ice-cold trains, with too little food and, above all, too little water. Upon arrival, chaos and violence reigned. As much as the Jews were already familiar with exclusion and arbitrariness from their hometowns, the arrival in Riga or Minsk was a deep shock. After arriving in Riga, German security police and Latvian police forces drove the people out of the wagons, beating them. Everything had to be done quickly, which was especially difficult for the elderly after the long and exhausting journey. Isidor Nussenbaum remembers, I quote, "Huge confusion. Parents were calling for their children, spouses were searching for their other half, and everyone was looking for their luggage." End of quote. Most deportees never saw their luggage again. Those who were strong enough marched off. The old and weak boarded waiting cars, but in many cases, they were never to reach the ghetto. The deportees were sent to various places in and near Riga, the Jungfernhof and Salaspils camps, and the Riga ghetto. Jungfernhof and Salaspils had to be built up by the first prisoners, and testimonies really testify how terrible the conditions were in those two camps. On December 10th, 1941, a transport from Cologne arrived in Riga, whose inmates were the first to march from the station to the ghetto, where they were directly confronted with the traces of the massacres of the last 2 days. Lilly Menzel describes this. "On the day of our arrival in the ghetto, we saw everywhere traces of the fact that people had been murdered there shortly before. There was frozen blood in the streets, a terrible sight. We found food on the table in the apartment. They hadn't even let the poor condemned people finish their meal. Similarly, in Minsk, where the reports also speak of violence and shouting on the part of the guards upon arrival. Gerd Hoffmann from Hamburg describes this in a letter after liberation. To the left and right of the train stood SS posts or guards in a close chain. The train stopped and we were chased out of the wagons with whips. The first shots were heard. That was our reception. We saw the first corpses. Again, also in Minsk, the deportees had to march several kilometers to the ghetto on foot, and some apparently were sent in trucks. For many, the so-called Red House, a former school, was the first stop there. The building was completely overcrowded. People were lying tightly packed in the rooms and in the corridors. After a few days there, they arrived in their actual accommodations. Bertolt Rudner, an Austrian who was deported from Berlin to Minsk, wrote about this in his diary. I quote, "The quarters turned out to be miserable wooden houses, plundered and demolished, which were also in an indescribable condition that a Central European would not be able to imagine." End of quote. Rudner shared a small two-room apartment with 18 people, in which there was neither running water nor electricity. The deportees quickly learned of the mass killing shortly before their arrival, as Gerhard Hoffmann recalls. I quote, "We heard this from a few survivors who had been hiding in basements to escape a sure death. They sneaked between houses in fear and tried to save some of their last belongings. Here and there, shots were heard. It was a heart-wrenching sight to be seen. At the moment, we were unable to comprehend this all." End of quote. Soon, they learned of the extent of the killings, but could hardly think about what they had heard. They had to go on organizing their lives, and they had to work. In both Riga and Minsk, the ghettos of German-speaking Jews were separate from those of the local Jews, which distinguishes these two ghettos from those in occupied Poland. In Minsk, there were two so-called special ghettos for the members of the various transports. In Riga, there was the German and the so-called small ghetto, where the surviving local Jews lived. These ghettos were separated from each other by fences. A Jewish self-administration appointed by the local German rulers was responsible for organizing life in the ghetto and providing labor forces. The most important positions in the self-administration were filled in each case by members of the first transports, in Riga from the Cologne transport, in Minsk from the Hamburg transport. The two German ghettos in Minsk were connected by a common Jewish council. They were divided into districts or camps, named after the places of origin of the deportees. Similarly, in Riga, the deportees were housed together in the transport groups, and the respective streets were also named after their places of origin. So there was a Hamburg, a Cologne, or a Leipzig street in the ghetto of Riga. In both ghettos, there was a Jewish hospital where doctors and nurses tried to help the people, but there was a lack of medicine and also a lack of necessary space. And on the slide, you see the entrance to the ghetto of Riga on a drawing by Bernd Hase, who was deported to Riga from the German town of Gelsenkirchen, and both wrote a memoir in 1945 and created some really amazing drawings documenting what he lived through during these last years. And I'm going to show you some more of his drawings. Despite the shock upon arrival, the deportees had to organize their lives in this strange and hostile environment. So the deported Jews began to clean up their new homes and make them as comfortable as possible. Erna Falk remembers the first phase of her life in Riga. "I was very unhappy, and yet, like the others, I had to set about cleaning up the small room, which had to suffice for 3 families." And Bertolt Rudner describes this in Minsk. "With a lot of work, the rooms were made up to some extent. Beds were searched for and found, and so at least a night's lodging was erected." End of quote. 2 of them shared one bed. In the nights, they therefore sometimes hardly got any rest. Everyone rolled around, the sick moaned, the air was bad, and at the same time, it was bitterly cold in this winter of 1941-42. So on this slide, you see one of the pages of Bertolt Ruttner's diary, which is, as far as I know, the only contemporary diary written by one of the deported Jews that had survived. We don't know really what happened to Bertolt Ruttner. He did not survive. He wrote his diary until beginning of June 1942. And we also don't know how this diary survived. It came to one of his pre-war comrades. We have no idea how. And he gave the diary in the late 1950s to the Institute of Contemporary History, where we preserve it in our archive. So on this slide, you see one of the pages from December 1941, where Ruttner describes these terrible nights in the ghetto. So the living conditions were terrible. Many fell ill, and the constant shortages also caused conflicts. Bertolt Ruttner again, harassment set in, and the fellow residents sank from level to level in misery. Human and animal vermin, rats and bugs, sometimes made life unbearable. There were no bathing facilities. To clean oneself thoroughly was only possible to a limited extent. End of quote. His friend Martha Krohn died of typhus as early as January 1942. And not only her. On January 13th, 1942, Ruttner noted in his diary, "Death is going around in the camp. The old and the sick are dying. There are also only mass graves. Every few days, about 20 dead are buried. It's a gruesome situation." End of quote. Those who wanted to survive had to supplement the meager official food rations by bartering and trading, and then smuggling the extra food when they returned from work in the evening, always at the risk of their lives, because death loomed if they were discovered. Survivors from Riga report that it happened again and again that they returned in the evening and found murdered Jewish men hanging from the gallows. Ghetto commander Kurt Krause also repeatedly shot women in the Jewish cemetery who had been convicted of smuggling. But the life-threatening bartering was without alternative. As Käthe Fries wrote in her report written in the summer of 1945, she wrote, "We had to barter, because otherwise I would not be sitting here today in front of the typewriter." Likewise in Minsk, where the SS shot ghetto residents again and again. But that didn't change anything. As Karl Löwenstein notes, bartering was forbidden and punishable by death. But that didn't stop anyone, because hunger hurts. And a survivor from Frankfurt recalls, "Prisoners had gold crowns and bridges broken out of their mouths to satisfy hunger." It was not only as punishment for bartering that the German guards committed murderers. Reports repeatedly mention arbitrary shootings or shootings for other offenses, such as not wearing the Jewish star. Even without the murders and larger Aktionen, violence was omnipresent. Various reports testify that in Riga, both Latvian policemen as well as German SS men repeatedly entered the ghetto at night and raped women. People tried to do something to counter these conditions, which were terrible in every respect. To a certain extent, an everyday and a cultural life emerged. Schooling was organized for children, musicians and artists offered various performances, and in Riga, there were even dance classes for a time. For some, their religion was particularly important, and they celebrated Jewish holidays as best as they could under the new conditions. In Riga, there were also soccer matches. They took place on the Blechplatz, which was often a place of terror and fear, as selections took place here and Jews were hanged. And on this drawing, again, a drawing by Bernd Hase, you see the gallows in the middle of this Blechplatz. But then there were also days when on this Blechplatz, the teams of Dortmund and Berlin, or the Jewish Order Service, and a team of Latvian Jews played soccer against each other. Despite the official ban on contact between the German and Latvian ghettos, there was contact on various levels, and friendships developed between the inhabitants of the two ghettos, especially between Latvian men, almost all of whom had lost their families during the mass shootings in November and December 1941, and German women. It was mainly the younger people who sought contacts. Overall, the relationship between German and Latvian Jews was often rather characterized by cultural distance and sometimes mistrust. The situation between the German and White Russian Jews in Minsk was similar. Karl Löwenstein names one reason for this in his memoirs, the mass shootings before the arrival of the German Jews. He writes, "Also, because of this, we were at first regarded by the Russians as their enemies, until we succeeded in convincing them that we were after all persecuted in exactly the same way by the National Socialists, and that we had not come to Minsk voluntarily, but forcibly." In the course of 1942 and 1943, the latest, the German authorities murdered those they regarded unfit for work in several actions. I do not want to go into detail about these different raids, but want to stress that they drastically changed the deportees' understanding about their own fate. They realized that the horrible fate of the Latvian and White Russian Jews shortly before their arrival had not been an exception. Hilde Sherman recalls, "Even the most gullible gradually realized that our days were numbered." They understood they would by no means be spared because, like the perpetrators, they saw themselves as Germans, came from the same culture, spoke the same language. The survivors of the respective actions moved daily in columns to their various work sites, and this continued until the ghettos were dissolved in October 1943 in Minsk and in November 1943 in Riga. However, even the workers were never safe. Again and again, selection took place. Still existing families were torn apart, people were murdered. In Minsk, during the ghetto liquidation, mainly young single men were deported to labor and extermination camps in occupied Poland. After the deportation from Minsk, often a true odyssey through various camps followed. Gerd Hoffmann, for example, was sent to various camps. He describes this in a letter shortly after liberation. "Now followed a time that was far worse than our ghetto life. We were pushed around from one camp to another. Labor camp, concentration camp, labor camp, hunger, disease, epidemics, beatings, shootings, gassings, and other brutalities." He was in Majdanek, Budzin, and Flossenbürg, among other places, and in the end was sent on one of the infamous death marches before being liberated by the Americans in Upper Bavaria. Many of his fellow prisoners died in these last days. And Gerhard Hoffmann writes about himself, quote, "I was starved, rotten, full of lies, and at times could only creep on all fours for a while." The remaining ghetto residents in Riga were sent to the newly built Riga Kaiserwald concentration camp in the north of the city, beginning in the summer of 1943. On November 2nd, 1943, the security police cleared the Riga ghetto in an action in which they selected children, the elderly, and the sick, while the other Jews were at their workplaces. Survivors recall this terrible day. Workers came back in the evening to the almost empty ghetto and realized that their friends and relatives were no longer there. They had been deported to Auschwitz. On November 6, 1943, the last ghetto residents were taken to Riga Kaiserwald. And on the slide, you see another drawing by Bernd Hase, and this is Riga Kaiserwald and one of the roll calls in the camp. Those, for many, Riga Kaiserwald was a transit camp where they were registered and then sent to other camps or to their workplaces where they also stayed overnight. Those who remained in Kaiserwald were now concentration camp prisoners. Families who had still been able to live together in the ghetto were separated. They had to hand in their clothes, had their hair shorn, and were assigned prisoner numbers. With the approach of the Red Army, the SS began to relocate the Jews who were still alive. For most of the Jews remaining in Riga, the further path of suffering led by ship to Danzig, and from there to the Stutthof concentration camp. This was, as survivors testify, hell. Terrible hygienic conditions devastated the already weakened people. Sick and weak prisoners were either murdered by the guards or left to die by themselves in so-called death zones. Since the camp was completely overcrowded in this autumn of 1944, Prisoners were sent to various concentration camps in the German Reich and others to subcamps of Stutthof. Edith Blau, whose postcard from the deportation train I presented a while ago, and her mother were among them. About 200 prisoners who had remained in the camp near Riga were sent from there to Libau in October 1944, and from there taken by ship to Hamburg in February 1945, and imprisoned there in the Fuhlsbüttel police prison. A group of 56 men came from there to Bergen-Belsen, and the rest had to set out together with other prisoners on a death march to Kiel on April 12, 1945, where they spent more terrible days in yet another camp before they were brought to Sweden in Red Cross buses at the beginning of May 1945. Of the more than 31,000 German, Austrian, and Czech Jews deported to the Baltic states, about 1,100 survived the Holocaust. And of the approximately 7,000 German Jews deported to the Minsk ghetto, according to current knowledge, about 50 survived. And with this, I come to some brief final remarks. Raoul Hilberg once wrote that every city has, quote, its own deportation history. I would say that it goes much further. Every deportee has his or her own deportation history. Only very few survived and were able to testify after liberation. And yet, an astonishing number of testimonies have survived. And I found many of those while I was a fellow here at the museum. And these testimonies document the individual persecution and deportation history of individual people. The personal accounts on which my research is based show how their authors found themselves from one day to the next in a world completely strange to them, a world marked by violence, brutality, hunger, and the permanent fear and constant threat of death. They also testify to people's attempts to counter all this, to organize their lives, and find ways and means to improve their desperate situation, to influence their fate. These personal sources also make very clear what it meant to lose friends and relatives, to be in uncertainty about their fate, or to know exactly what awaited their loved ones or had already been done to them. Edith Blau and her mother had managed to stay together. They escaped during the last days of the war. Then they disguised their identities as foreign laborers and then as German ones to work for German troops. They were transported with those troops to Bornholm in Denmark, where they were finally liberated. And already in mid-May 1945, Edith Blau, later Edith Brandon, whom you see on this picture shortly after liberation, writes a long testimony about what she lived through. And the very first words, you see this, the first page of the testimony on this slide, it's from May 1945, and the very first words read, "How do you start when your heart is so full of everything? Where do you find the words at this moment when your memory throws everything into confusion? Hands tremble, and one wants to say everything in one big word. But I know that this word does not exist." And still, she and many others told their stories. And I wanted to present some of these stories tonight. And with this, I thank you for your attention.
Good evening. Before I start, just a reminder that I believe you were given index cards when you checked in, and those are for questions and answers. If you want to fill out a card with a question and pass it to the end of the row, my colleagues will pick it up and bring it up to me to ask Andrea. So I should say that I'm Betsy Anthony. As Lisa said before, I'm the director of Visiting Scholar Programs at the Mandel Center here at the museum. I'm also a historian at the Mandel Center. And I'm going to help with Q&A tonight with Andrea. My own work focuses on Viennese Jews and the post-war Viennese Jewish community, so German-speaking Jews. And so I feel very close to your work and am very touched by it, not just because of that connection, but also because, I was working with survivors and survivor testimony, and you're telling the story of their families, of their relatives that couldn't give testimony or couldn't tell their stories. And so I would like to start with actually this photo and a question I have related to it. This photo comes from a collection that we hold here at the museum that was donated by Lily Schischa Tauber. Lily was a survivor who returned to Vienna and who I interviewed and got to know. And you heard many words from Wilhelm and Oscar, I think, and saw these photographs that were taken in the Opole ghetto of Lily's family. And it was a privilege for me to watch you go through that collection and analyze it so I could learn more about Lily's family. And so my first question for you is, did you find other collections like that? Were you able to find that rich? It seemed that way from this excellent presentation. Were you able to find other collections and letters and photos that gave such texture and detail?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. So this Schischa collection is really, really special in two senses. First of all, that we do have these photographs. I already said this in my presentation, but I would really like to repeat it. It's so special because it was Wilhelm Schischa who asked the local photographer to take these photographs, and he wanted this to be documented, and he wanted to send those photographs to his loved ones. So it's not as opposed to many, many other photographs we have from the deportations and also from ghettos. It's not the perpetrators' views, but it's really Wilhelm Schischa wanted to have this documented and asked the photographer. And we don't have many photographs like this. We do have some more from Opole Lubelski. I found two other but really small collections where the deported Jews also asked probably the same photographer to take pictures and send them home. But the other thing that makes the Schischa collection so special is that they really send letters at least twice a week for a period of almost a year. And this is something we normally don't have. When Jews were deported, they sometimes send one or two letters and then we don't have anything more. So this is very special. And there's one collection I found here at the museum that is similar in this respect. And these are letters written by Artur Czuczka, who is also a Jew deported from Vienna in February 1941. And he has a really, I mean, all these stories are heartbreaking, but he has a really heartbreaking story because his brother, together with his family, was able to emigrate to the US. And he managed to get affidavits for Artur as well. So Artur could have left, but he didn't want to leave his mother all alone in Vienna. So he stayed with his mother. And in this collection, there are many, many letters written by both the mother and Artur when they were still in Vienna. And then his mother died in January 1941. And then he wanted to emigrate, but it was too late. And only 1 month later, so in February 41, he was deported from Vienna to Opole Lubelski. And this collection is really similar in a way. He also sent so many letters. I don't really know how many, but at least twice a week. And some of those letters were really several pages long. And he describes his life in the ghetto in such a detail. And they are also really, really interesting when it comes to history of emotions, because it's all about how he is absolutely alone in this ghetto, as opposed to the Schischa family. He came to Opole on his own. His mother just died. And so he's still writing about the loss of his mother in these letters, and then he's writing about how he's absolutely alone and what importance his brother's letters have for him. So his brother in the US was still able to send him letters and also some parcels via Lisbon. And so these letters he received were really the only connection he had to somebody he loves, to somebody he knew. And he also documents life in the ghetto in a very detailed way. He also found a place to live with local Jews. And it's interesting, he describes the local Jews in a totally different manner than Wilhelm Schischa. He wasn't as critical about the locals. He was much more critical about the deported Viennese Jews. And he was angry with them, saying that they are so arrogant and that the way they behaved, it's no wonder that the local Jewish population doesn't like them. So he has a totally different perspective in a way, but still it's the same fate. And one thing I want to add that was very special for me, his nephew, so the son of the brother who emigrated to the US in 38, end of 38, still lives here in Washington, D.C. He's 97 years old. And I was able to meet him while I was here. And that was really special to listen to him telling about how these letters arrived and how his father was so sad because the more letters arrived and the more he learned, the more he was sure that he won't see his brother again. So that was really interesting to really see these both perspectives.
Thank you. It looks like there are some questions. Thank you, Andrew, very much. Okay. Well, actually, it looks like the first question coordinates very much with what you were just saying. How did photos and letters and diaries get out of the East and make it back to families and ultimately to archival collections?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is not really easy because it really depends on the time and also the place. So what makes these collections we just talked about so special is that I don't really know why it was allowed that they wrote in such detail, but there was no censorship in this very early stage. So these letters are really, really detailed. And later on, it really, and they were able to just send them. So Arthur Schischa's letters reached his family in the US. And all this was not possible anymore at a later time. And it really depends on the time. So for example, for those deported to the Lodz ghetto in autumn 41, there first was a mail ban, then there was no mail ban, and some Jews were able to send postcards, but then there was censorship, and many of the postcards didn't leave the ghetto, but they survived within the ghetto archives, so we still can use these postcards even if they did never reach the people they were sent to. And then in Riga and Minsk, it was again totally different because there it was strictly forbidden to send postcards or letters, and it was forbidden under the threat of death penalty. And in many testimonies, I found evidence that they really shot people when they found out that people tried to smuggle letters. But that it was forbidden does not mean that it didn't happen. It did happen, and especially for Riga, I have it in many testimonies that people remember how they would, for example, ask a German soldier whom they met at work to smuggle a letter home. And Edith Blau, whom I already quoted in my presentation, she's a very interesting example for this. She still managed to be in touch when she was in Riga with her uncle in Minden. He was a German soldier, he was in the German Wehrmacht, and he found colleagues whom he trusted. And so she received letters and parcels. And it's called the Edith Brennan collection here at the museum, there's one really, really interesting letter from 44. She was already deported from Riga to Stutthof concentration camp together with her mother. And from there, temporarily sent to a local farm in the area. And she managed to get into contact with a pre-war friend from Danzig, Gdansk. who visited her at this farm. And then Edith Blau gave her a letter which was sent to her uncle. And this letter is really, really amazing because it's from the end of 44. And she knew that she has to go back to Stutthof concentration camp very soon. And she writes, first of all, she tells her uncle what happened to them during these last weeks and years in Riga. And then she mentions how terrible Stutthof concentration camp is and that she is so fearful of having to go back to Stutthof very, very soon. And yeah, this is really special. And this letter really reached her uncle, and it's preserved in the collections here. So, so there were various ways how people still managed to either really send those postcards and letters or somehow smuggle them. There was censorship, especially for late letters that were written later. There was censorship, and they sometimes just didn't or weren't sent. And then to your question, the question you read about how they came to these collections. I mean, for those letters that have been sent to already emigrated children, those children just kept the letters and postcards and gave them to the archives later on. It's difficult to say how many postcards and letters were written to Jews still in Austria and Germany who were themselves deported later on. And so these letters and postcards did not survive. So probably there were so many more. But as those who received them were deported later on, we just don't have those postcards and letters.
Of course. Thank you. Okay, this is a little bit long. You said a few things that made me wonder more about interactions deportees had with local Jews, the community or individuals, or even the other ghetto that you mentioned with local Jews. For example, you mentioned smuggling in the Jewish cemetery. What did that mean about contact with locals? And can you say more about interactions with locals and Jewish and not Jewish?
This is a huge question, and we could probably talk about this question for another hour. These interactions between the local Jews and the deported Jews were really, really, really complicated, and it's a complicated topic. I mentioned it briefly, how there were stereotypes and prejudices. And also regarding this topic, it really depends on the place. I have the impression that it wasn't that bad in Riga, where many local Jews spoke German after all. So they were at least able to communicate. And for Riga, I also found some cases of friendships, of love, and even marriages within the ghetto. In general, the situation was not that good. There were really many, many stereotypes. As I said in my presentation, the local Jews sometimes blamed the new arriving Jews for worsening their situation. I mean, the ghettos were already overcrowded, and now, like for example, in the Lodz ghetto, another 20,000 Jews were brought to the ghetto. In Riga and Minsk, there were these terrible mass shootings before the German Jews arrived, and so the locals sometimes blamed the new arrivals that this was connected and that it was their fault. And many German Jews had a kind of very arrogant manner of looking onto this kind of local Jews, these Eastern Jews, Ostjuden. And I found many diaries and letters where they would describe them as dirty, as very old-fashioned. I mean, these German Jews and many Austrian Jews were very assimilated. They regarded themselves more as Germans or Austrians than as Jews. And so they were really confused when they saw some of these, for example, in the letters by Wilhelm Schischa, he's so confused about these Orthodox Jews he finds in Opole Lubelskie. And on the other hand, the locals found the German Jews so arrogant, and they thought that they were still so rich when they arrived with their suitcases. Also in many diaries from the Lodz ghetto and also in post-war testimonies, I found that the German Jews did not really manage to see that those local Jews in some cases already lived for more than a year in the ghetto, and that it was the German politics who made the situation so worse. So they came to these ghettos in this already really bad situation and didn't see what caused this conflict. And especially for Lodz, we have many diaries that really show how bad these conflicts were. There's, for example, the very well-known diary written by David Shirakowiak, a young 17-year-old boy who was very negative about these German Jews who arrived because, first of all, the schools had to be closed down because the schools served as mass quarters. And then he also wrote in his diary that, well, these aren't really Jews. These are all Christians who maybe have one like Jewish grandmother. And then he even writes that maybe these German Jews will found a anti-Semitic club in the ghetto. So this is really an extreme example, but I think this was really the attitude of many Jews. They were two totally different worlds that came together under these totally unbearable conditions. Yeah, maybe I leave it at that.
I'm sorry, I think we have time for one more question. Your questions are so good. Thank you. It's been hard to choose.
And my answers are too long.
But we have a reception later where we can all talk and we can corner you. But I'm going to, but I think this one is a good one to end on. How could some of the letter writers or the diarists you mentioned know that something horrible awaited them if they were to be deported onward? One example said the writer knew they would disappear into the dark or something like that, he writes. What could they have known?
It's not really easy to give short answers to these kind of questions. Again, it really depends on the question of when somebody was deported. And then it's also the question of how you would define knowledge. I mean, there were so many rumors and there were letters. For example, the situation in Vienna was really special because all these letters I quoted from tonight, all after these first deportations, reached Vienna. So, I mean, this wasn't about mass murder, but Jews in Vienna really knew that deportation to the east meant something terrible. So even if they did not know what was really going to start to happen very soon after the deportation in 41 and 42, they knew that something terrible would happen. And in other cases, they just heard rumors. I mean, the official version, the German version, was they are going to send to the east to work. In some cases, they even said, you're going to build something up in the east, we're going to colonize it. So it really depended. For example, in the diary of Victor Klemperer in his Jew house in Dresden, already in January 1942, writes that he heard about mass shootings in Riga. So sometimes, either through letters or through soldiers, there was some very concrete knowledge about what was going on. But even that did not know that they understood the scope of what was going on there. And that was what I wanted to show with this example of Oskar Hoffmann, who was deported in July 1942, when the remaining Jews in Germany really started worrying about what happened to the deportees. And from Riga and Minsk, they didn't even get any letters. They didn't receive any news. So they knew that something was terribly wrong. But even then, at this late stage, when he arrived in Minsk and the local guards told him, well, don't worry, you're going to work on a farm, he believed it. And this is something we find in many diaries also from like occupied Poland, from the ghettos, like even after those deportations and even when when news arrived to the ghetto that, oh, we heard that those deported have been killed. In many of the same diaries, I still find, yeah, but we work, so we are going to work. So it's really difficult to define what this kind of knowledge meant.
Andrea, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us tonight. And it was a pleasure. It's a pleasure having you back for a few days, but it was a sincere pleasure working with you for 9 months. And thank you all for your good questions. I hope you will join me in, again, thanking Andrea, and also join me upstairs for a reception in her honor, please.